Trying to sum up an entire generation of people can be a notoriously hard thing for a movie, or really any story for that matter, to pull off correctly. Because more often than not, the writer isn't actually a part of the generation in question, and thus has a very flawed understanding of how they actually think. But at the same time, even those of the same generation might run into the same problem if they happen to be different from most other people their age. As I just said, it's a concept that isn't explored all that much because of how easy it is to get wrong. And today, I'd like to go over two specific movies that tried and failed to sum up a generation of people and explain why exactly they didn't work. And needless to say, there will be spoilers for both movies ahead. So in case you'd like to see either of them for yourself first and don't want to know what happens, you should probably remain on the lookout. I won't be giving out any other spoiler warnings in this video. Okay, so the two movies in question here would be the 1957 film adaptation of Ernest Hemingway's classic novel, The Sun Also Rises, and Ben Stiller's 1994 comedy drama film Reality Bites, which are both infamous for trying to sum up a generation of people and failing miserably at it. Now, in the case of The Sun Also Rises, it was already at a disadvantage because Hemingway wrote the novel as a way to sum up the lost generation, aka the generation of people who grew up during and immediately after World War I. The people who entered adulthood and were instantly thrown into a conflict they weren't mentally prepared for, and thus once it was over turned to hedonism as a way to cope with the horrors that they were exposed to at way too young of an age. That's what Hemingway was trying to capture with his book, and many would argue that he succeeded at it, which isn't too surprising considering he was one such victim of the lost generation. However, the movie was made almost 30 years after said generation had grown up, so it was already going to have a difficult time understanding and trying to capture what Hemingway had. And one of the biggest problems with the film in this department is its cast. Because as I just got through saying, the book is about people in their mid-20s at the most trying to cope with having their childhoods prematurely destroyed by war, and how it drives them to depression and self-destruction as a result. But that ends up kind of lost when most of the cast ranges from their mid-30s to early 40s in age. Seriously, Tyrone Power, who plays the lead, was around 42 years old when this was filmed, and on top of that, his underlying health problems that would ultimately kill him were starting to show, making him appear even older when his character is supposed to be in his mid-20s. And the same goes for Ava Gardner, who plays the lead, and she was 36 at the time of filming, and similarly her bohemian lifestyle was starting to catch up with her. So not only was she 36, she looked it, and her character is supposed to be at least 10 years younger than that. And the same goes for the rest of the cast as well. They're all way too old for their parts and thus can't properly convey what Ernest Hemingway was trying to say with them. Really, the only one even remotely close to the character's intended age was Errol Flynn, and he was similarly the one aspect of the movie that was met with praise by Hemingway himself, who otherwise hated the film. So as a result of all of this ill-advised casting, the movie ends up coming across as more about a bunch of depressed people trying desperately to make something of their lives, rather than capturing the feelings of lost youth destroyed by war, and the characters' futile attempts to regain it and bury their depression like Hemingway had intended. And for that reason alone, the movie fails to sum up or understand the lost generation, because even if some people from that generation were a part of the movie, they were simply too old to be able to effectively get the intended feelings across. And as a result, Hemingway disowned the final product, and both critics and audiences didn't take to it either, both back then and nowadays. Now on the flip side, we have Reality Bites, whose cast is most definitely the proper age for the generation they're representing, but that's one of the only things the movie has going for it. Because simply put, the story of a group of people in their early 20s acting like they know better than the rest of the world and being hesitant to own up to their adult responsibilities because they have to bow to the man is not really a compelling story. And not to mention, isn't a very profound look at the generation the movie is trying so hard to understand. Because instead of being an honest look at what was troubling the youth and young adults of its day, the movie commits to this idea of nonconformity and going against the man so hard that it almost comes across as a parody of what young people were like rather than a sincere introspective of what was really troubling them. Because while it's easy to understand what's bothering a lot of the characters, the fact that most of them won't own up to their responsibilities and just generally act like they know better doesn't make them come across as all that likable. And when you're telling a group of people that these characters represent you, that's a problem. And this is perhaps most evident in the way the narrative treats both Michael and Troy. Because simply put, Michael is a nice guy who's got a good head on his shoulders and already has himself set up for a comfortable life, and even outright admits that he doesn't need to be rich to be happy. While Troy, on the other hand, is a needless rebel and bad boy with a genius-level intellect, but doesn't do anything productive with it because he's afraid of giving up his independence and integrity. And yet, because Michael has conformed to the man, he's the one that's supposed to be seen as in the wrong. Sure, it wasn't right for him to re-edit her documentary, and he didn't seem to understand why she was so upset about it, but even with that, in any other movie, he would be presented as the hero of the story because he's frankly the perfect example of what most want out of life. But here, his conformity to societal norms is ultimately treated as a deal breaker, and Leanna instead ends up with Troy because he gets and understands her because he won't bow to the man. Now, to be fair, if this were a science fiction film where the man is an evil warlord or something, this story would work a lot better. But as an attempt to understand, reach, and sum up young people of its time in real life, it falls flat on its face. Because, as I just said, the sentiments evoked by the characters who are supposed to be seen as in the right aren't ones that were felt by the generation at large, and that, combined with them not coming across as all that likable, makes any attempt by the movie to be sincere totally fail. At least in The Sun Also Rises, it's easier to feel sorry for the characters even with their more jerkish behavior, because it's made clear that it all stems from underlying issues, from experiences beyond their control that makes them act that way, and not simply because they're too lazy to own up to their responsibilities and think they know better than those in higher positions than them. And honestly, that's one reason I would argue that The Sun Also Rises is a better film overall than Reality Bites. Because while it may fail miserably at summing up the lost generation, it does still have its good points. Like, for example, Tyrone Power may be way too old for his character, but his performance is still pretty heartbreaking if you're able to look past that. This was a man who had everything in life going for him, only to be left impotent by a war injury, and for the woman he loves to leave him because she can't face the prospect of a sexless marriage. and he's able to sell the tragedy of his character's underlying depression, anger, and self-loathing very effectively. And similarly, though also too old for her character, Ava Gardner is surprisingly convincing as a woman who saw way too many atrocities and tries to cope with the depression her past brings her through indulging in as much hedonism as possible. Behind that fun, flirtatious smile, there lies an extremely sad and unfulfilled woman, and Gardner is able to convey all of that really well. And the same goes for most of the other characters too. Sure, with the exception of Errol Flynn, they may not do a good job of playing the characters from the book, but their performances are still rather good ones if looked at from outside that context. What I'm trying to say here is, even if it fails to sum up the Lost Generation, the 1957 adaptation of The Sun Also Rises still has something to offer. You can still feel for the characters, and ultimately the story does still work to an extent. Sure, there is also the common complaint that it's kind of boring, but it was actually a very accurate adaptation of the novel, so that probably comes more down to the fact that the book's story wasn't the best suited for a movie than anything else. To put it simply, it's no masterpiece. It fails to do its intended job, but there's still something to it in spite of that. You can still get invested in the characters' stories, to the point that it's frankly impossible not to feel sorry for them. So if you can look past its issues, this movie can still feel pretty depressing, and maybe even a little haunting, because the story has substance. To an extent, it still works when removed from what it was supposed to be. And that's a luxury Reality Bites simply does not have. Because as I was saying before, no matter which way it's viewed from, this movie doesn't really work. It fails to sum up the sentiments of a generation, and even when looked at independently of that, it's just not a very good story. I mean, don't get me wrong, there is some stuff that works. It's not like it's one of the worst films ever made or anything like that. It's just that in addition to not being able to do what it set out to, it couldn't tell a compelling story on top of that. Because even if you remove the whole generation thing from the equation, you've still got characters that aren't very likable, who rebel against life without any real reason to. And a story that's lacking in real substance and meaning. And once again, for any and all of its other faults, at least The Sun Also Rises is able to have something to say with the story and has the potential to make the audience feel something by the time it's over. Sure, that might not be saying much, but considering where both these movies stand overall, it's not a very high bar to clear. So as I said at the start, trying to sum up an entire generation of people in a single story is not an easy thing to pull off, and the failure of both The Sun Also Rises and Reality Bites to capture what the people of their respective times were really feeling only proves that. It may have been for different reasons that they failed in their intended task, but if anything, that only goes to show just how easy it is to get a story of this nature wrong, and that it's best to avoid it entirely unless one really knows what they're talking about like Ernest Hemingway did. Because in the end, the biggest problem both these movies have is their lack of understanding for the people they're trying to represent, which is why both aren't able to say anything meaningful about them. Though, like I already said, the story behind the movie version of The Sun Also Rises in isolation does arguably have something to offer where Reality Bites doesn't. But that still doesn't change the fact that it couldn't capture the feelings of the Lost Generation. In the end, neither movie is an accurate representation of the generation they were trying to embody, and as a result are only remembered today for their failure to do that. Alright, that's everything I had to say on that. So now I'd like you to give me your thoughts on this. Do you believe that both Reality Bites and The Sun Also Rises are perfect examples of a movie trying and failing to sum up a generation to the point that they never should have been made? Or do you believe there's more to them than I gave them credit for? And do you think The Sun Also Rises works better as just a movie in isolation than Reality Bites, or not? Whatever the case, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And please keep in mind that you do not have to agree with any opinions here if you don't want to. You can feel about both The Sun Also Rises and Reality Bites however you'd like. And if you think I had them all wrong, that is perfectly okay. And thank you all for watching. It is all greatly appreciated. And I hope to see you all next time.